Okay, so there's a really interesting question that comes up here. We know what the answer is, but it leads to a really powerful statement made by James Gunn about Superman and his new movie. So, welcome to Philosophy All Along, where we try and go even deeper into the deepest meanings of the things that we love. So, here today, we're going to be just talking about the question of Superman bleeding and what does that mean, right? Because in the newest Superman trailer, we see Superman beaten and battered and bleeding. So, to start with, yes, right, he bleeds. We know this, especially for those of you who are like, long comic book readers, you know that he bleeds, right? One of the most iconic images in my head is, of course, the image of from the Death of Superman comics, right, where we see him being held by Lois Lane. In fact, I have my old graphic novel here, right, and we see it, right? We see, the blood there with good old Superman having been beaten bloody by Doomsday. So this is really kind of made very powerful by James Gunn, the director of the new film, because when he, I think, looks at images like this, and when he's thinking about his own film, he makes the following statement. And so I saw this just, to give credit initially on Screen Rant, right, which is, they put out some interesting articles. So James Gunn says, we do have a battered Superman in the beginning. That is our country. I believe in the goodness of human beings, and I believe that most people in this country, despite their ideological beliefs, their politics, are doing their best to get by and be good people, despite what it might seem like to the other side, no matter what the other side might be. This movie is about that. It's about the basic kindness of human beings, not a fascist power fantasy. It felt good to be doing something that was about a person's kindness. So there's a lot there. And just to kind of pull out a couple of moments that he points out, right? He says that he's clearly making a connection between Superman and kind of the country as a whole, right? That the country is battered, right? And that's, I think that we can argue that's pretty true, right? I think people are feeling very divided, and they're feeling. I mean, I can't drive around to work at this point without feeling like people are trying to kill me on the road. Like, there's so much kind of just violence out there. And he seems to be suggesting here that his movie is going to be about kindness rather than just about power. And that's really interesting to me, because Superman is such an opportunity to make a statement about power. There's always this worry, like for those of you who, know philosophy, like Superman has this weird kind of connection to Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a philosopher, and the idea of the Übermensch, or the overman, or the Superman, right? This person who's kind of like better than everybody else, who acts as kind of an ideal, but also someone who doesn't have to follow the rules because of their kind of supremacy. And this idea was one that was taken by like the Nazis, and they ran with it and really kind of twisted what Nietzsche meant. But you can see like that Gunn has a concern that the very notion of Superman, and I think just in heroes in general, can be used as kind of a reason to not just kind of do violence, but to justify things like fascism. And what do we mean by that? Just briefly, what do we mean? Because we throw the word around a lot, especially in our politics. Oh, they're a fascist. Oh, that politician is like Hitler, and so on and so forth. And what we really kind of mean there, I guess, in sometimes like the strictest philosophical and like kind of political definitions, is we mean an ideology in which violence and hatred and antagonism are justified by virtue of the belief set that one is better than others, or our group is better than others. We are somehow supreme and better than you, and that justifies us being able to do what we want to you, right? So fascism isn't just the idea of like, okay, we're going to laud ourselves. It's not just an exceptionalism idea. It is also an idea that seems to walk hand in hand with the idea that, and in our supposed betterness, that gives us the ethical and moral righteousness to kind of do whatever we want to those who are not part of our group. And so James Gunn seems very worried that, heroes and superheroes can be kind of used to justify that they are maybe somehow outside of the rules and can do harm in the ways that they want, and that they can force people to follow their own agenda, right? You see that, I think, a lot in The Boys, right, which is a great TV show, but also something that I want to say, if you're sensitive in any way, it is a really hard watch, both in terms of violence and sexuality and just kind of showing how awful human beings can be. And it seems that Gunn wants to take it in the opposite direction. This is something of an old trope with Superman. The idea that Superman is an ideal that can give people hope, right? You see this especially in the kind of Christopher Reeves and Brendan Ruth gestures towards Superman. And it seems that Gunn wants to ratchet that up. I don't mean just kind of look back in this nostalgic way. It seems that what he's saying when he says he wants it to be a film about kindness, that's really interesting to me, right? As opposed to about power. Because it almost suggests that Superman's way of overcoming, like that his true superpower, isn't going to be his strength, but his way of overcoming is going to be his compassion and his kindness. And I do think that brings us to an interesting point. I remember reading, and I can't remember the author at the top of my head, but they did a book on Batman and philosophy. One of the authors argued that Batman actually did have a superpower, not in a literal sense, but that a superpower was kind of like a super will, right? That whereas most of us would be like, I'm tired, I don't want to exercise anymore, Batman's like, well, I'll do it anyways, right? That kind of a thing, Like we want to like take a nap or play a video game or whatever else, and he's like, I'm going to go study detective stuff, right? Like that anytime we kind of lack the strength of will not to eat the candy bar or whatever, Batman is like, I'm not eating that candy bar, right? It's all kale all the time, I guess. So anyways, I think that what this does is suggest what James Gunn might be suggesting here is that Superman's real superpower isn't, the laser beams from the eyes and the strength and all of that. If anything, when you think about it in a lot of ways, that's like kind of common now in our superhero infused media, that really what his superpower is still being kind despite the power. I don't just mean like, oh, Superman's superpower is kindness and compassion, which is not insignificant. But if you think about it, here you have a guy who could just like basically punch the earth into oblivion if he so chose, right? Like his power level is so extreme that he's literally unstoppable. The fact that he still retains a deep compassion for others, that and I should add, when you look at what the word compassion means, like in terms of where it comes from, the word passion, its etymology means suffering, right? And then compassion. So compassion means to suffer together, right? And so for Superman to have compassion for others, someone who can't be harmed, heals instantly, right? He's kind of this perfect strength, power, deity. To still have compassion means that he's still willing to experience harm in order to show care, to engage in kindness. And that becomes a superpower not just when we do it, like, any one of us showing compassion, that's significant. But for someone who doesn't have to, who literally has ultimate power, and to instead focus on kindness and trying to help others, that's a superpower by my lights. And so it's interesting that what we end up, I think, seeing as a final point here is that the idea of Superman bleeding is a way of, instead of thinking about it as like, oh, he can be hurt too, you don't need to worry about it. Like Superman at the end of the day is always invincible, is always going to come back from the dead. Like that's part of the narrative. But that Superman's bleeding is a way of showing that he, in a metaphorical sense, can be vulnerable. And I think, in other words, vulnerable in the strongest way possible, which is the vulnerability between people emotionally, right? That he is willing to engage in compassion, that he is willing to suffer with us, suffer with people who often demonize him. I think we're going to see that in this film a bit, right? You see someone like throwing a can at the back of his head, that he's willing to suffer with us, and that his bleeding becomes kind of a metaphor for that. So my supervisor over there is telling me it's time to go. So thank you so much for your time today. If you enjoyed this, please, like it, please share it. If you have any thoughts, anything I missed, anything you want to add to it, please put it in the comments. So please like and subscribe, and have a wonderful day.